Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We hope that everybody's been able to log back on. Just a note, it's been pointed out that some people have been having some difficulty getting on to the slides, the PowerPoint portion of the presentation. If you try the first link that was sent along to you and you get a message that there's no capacity left, we are using two servers. So if the first link is telling you that there's no space for you, then please link in through the second link, which will take you to our second server, which will give you exactly the same presentation and same information, and you'll be able to get on that way. Just again, to bring us back up to speed, in the first section of our program, we had a wonderful overview from Dr. Gould and from Kerri Smith about some of the theoretical issues behind suicide, contagion, and clusters, and then a discussion of reporting and media and safe messaging around suicide prevention. In the second portion, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Dolores Cimini, Dr. Greg Eells, and Dr. Phil Meilman, who will be sharing with us their experiences in managing campus-based suicide clusters and episodes of contagion. The three of them are all extremely experienced, well-known professionals in the field of college mental health who've had among them a tremendous wealth of experience and share a tremendous amount of common wisdom, and will be sharing that with us. So to speak to us first will be Dolores Cimini, but before that, just a moment again of housekeeping. We're going to use the same format for this section, even though there are three presenters, so we'll have the three presentations. We will then have a brief discussion among the five panelists, and then hopefully we'll have, again, a 20-minute or so period of time for questions from the audience. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to post a question, we were able to get to a fair number of them. Some we responded to directly on the Q&A site. But look at the top toolbar on your screen. There's a Q&A button there. If you click that, type your question, and then either click the Ask button or hit Enter. Your question will be posted, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the presentation. If we can't get to your question, we will try to get back to you or have someone respond to you. Just a couple of things. We are again recording this, so both the PowerPoints will be available as PDFs, and the recording of this webinar will be available on the SAMHSA, SPRC, and JED Foundation sites. There will be probably a bit of a delay in getting those posted, but they'll be there soon. We'll also be including links to a number of the references and other websites that are being discussed in the presentation. So we'll try to cover as many of those as we can in the process of doing the website for the presentation. So I'd like to now introduce Dr. Dolores Cimini, who is the Assistant Director for Prevention and Program Evaluation at the University of Albany, which is part of the SUNY system, who's going to share some of her experience at Albany with us. Dolores, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Vic, and thanks to SAMHSA and SPRC and the JED Foundation for inviting me to present. I'm truly honored to have this opportunity. What I'd like to start by doing is to describe what our university looks like so that you can have a chance to think about this in terms of scalability. The University at Albany is one of the 64 campuses in the State University of New York system. It's one of the 4 research centers at the university, and it's also a Research II and NCAA Division I institution. We have 18,000 students, 13,000 of which are undergraduate students. We're a residential campus, and most of our students who are undergraduates actually live in residence. So we are a very, very large campus. Since 1990 or so, we have developed and have been implementing a comprehensive prevention program. So we've been at this for a while, and we started our journey, in fact, with alcohol and substance abuse prevention. And here before you, you see some of the elements of our comprehensive program. I won't take time to go over these, but I want to express to you the point here that suicide prevention and substance abuse prevention and prevention in general is not the responsibility of one person or one unit. It's a collaborative effort across an entire campus. This is another way that we slice our suicide prevention program at the University at Albany. It's based on a public health approach, and this diagram is taken from the Institute of Medicine report on alcohol abuse prevention published in 2002. So we use a combination of universal interventions, which are on the left side of the triangle, which address the entire campus community, which promote health and reduce risk. In the middle part of the triangle are the interventions that we implement to reach students who are at high risk early, and they are often groups like first-year students, student-athletes, fraternity and sorority members, international students, transfer students, and students mandated for policy violations. So we try and get to them early through things like screening, a hotline service, early interventions. And, of course, we have treatment and referral, and those are the things that many counseling centers have been doing for years. And I wanted to also say at this point that this is a prevention program, but it also informs our postvention after a student death, and of course then our postvention informs the improvement and enhancement of our prevention program. This is our substance abuse prevention program. Again, same diagram, very similar interventions. We believe that when we intervene to address suicide risk, we're also intervening to reduce substance use and vice versa. Of course, these things go along together, risk for substance abuse and risk for suicide. So when we deal with one, we're addressing the other. So in terms of the piece of our prevention program and comprehensive program that we have to inform our postvention, in 1990, we developed a document called Responding to Students in Crisis, and that addresses step-by-step how we deal with student deaths. And that includes deaths by suicide, deaths by homicide, other types of deaths, as well as other types of campus crises. Hand in hand with that, we developed in 2004 a program called CareNet, Consultation and Resource Evaluation, because, of course, when high-risk situations occur on campus, like student deaths and the like, we have challenges that occur around requests for services and students in crisis needing assistance and the like. Okay, I'm going to. So with responding to students in crisis, some of the key elements with that are confidentiality, that is, we relay information across our team on a need-to-know basis. We use our best judgment as we address crisis situations. We coordinate our services, we stay in communication, and we support each other. We have a comprehensive crisis response team consisting of representatives from our Student Affairs Division, Counseling Center, Health Center, from our Chapel House Interface Center, departments, University Police, departments that would deal with student deaths, and we also have representatives from our Media and Communications Office on campus who really work with us very well, I would say, in dealing with safe messaging. Okay, and so with our campus community, I'll go into now the cluster suicides that we experienced. They occurred in 2011 in the spring, and we had one in the beginning of February, and this was of a sophomore, a white female, who was very well connected on campus, had a lot of friends, a lot of contacts. The second suicide occurred on April 1st, April Fool's Day. It was a student of color, and he was a freshman living on the same quad as the first student, but not with having any contact at all. The two students never knew each other. The student of color as well was a member of our EOP program, so a member of the program of students who are at high risk for academic failure, academically disadvantaged, and financially disadvantaged. The third suicide occurred off campus a week after graduation, and this was of a student as well who lived on the same quadrangle as the other two students who completed suicide, but what did not really have, when we followed up, really much contact with any other students at all. He was very isolated. Each student suicide demanded, though we used guidelines from SPRC and from the JED Foundation and our own responding to students in crisis protocol, but because of the context of each suicide, each situation demanded a different response. And on the slide before you see some of the things that we needed to address. So safe messaging and social media and dealing with the media. So with the first suicide, I have to tell you first that part of our protocol is that when a student death occurs, our university police contacts the local police of the next of kin of the student who is deceased, and the local police inform the parents or next of kin. In the case of the first suicide, I said the student was very well connected, and within literally 2 or 3 minutes of the student death, which was by hanging, there was information on the student's Facebook profile saying, "Rest in peace. We're sorry that you passed away," that kind of thing. At the same time, the police were not able to contact the parents, so the 16-year-old younger sister of the deceased student found out of the student death, and of course you can imagine then what occurred. So Facebook was a big problem for us in terms of the speed of information and our ability to notify next of kin. And I don't really have an answer for you at this point, but just to be aware that was an issue. Outside of that, the post-vention process for this student death went as planned. Protocol was followed. People worked very well together, and the progress was expected. With the second suicide, as I mentioned, it was a student of color in our EOP program. That was a substance abuse-involved suicide where the student hung himself and actually filmed his death on his Mac so that others would see what occurred. And with this student, this was a student who was very spiritual, very religious, had a lot of student contacts who were very spiritual, very religious, and so as a result, as part of the process of post-vention, we needed to deal with the students and the actual EOP program staff glorifying the suicide, saying he's in a better place and the like. And we were able to deal with that effectively, and actually still 5 years later are dealing with some of the aftermath of this because the program is so insulated and so isolated in some ways. They only have a few of us that they work with. So very important to communicate on that and be aware of the cultural issues. The other thing that was occurring among the students, even though the first student and the second student who completed suicide didn't know each other, the second student's friends, who were primarily students of color, were saying things like, well, you had a memorial service for the white girl. What's going to happen with the black boy? Are you going to have the same thing for him? So very much a theme of, is there going to be equity and equality here? Another thing that happened, particularly around Facebook and social media, is that the media, outside of our campus, were contacting the peer educators that I supervise who work on our crisis hotline. And they were asking for details about the suicide, what did they think? And fortunately, I've trained my students as part of their training class how to respond to the media, and they always follow a policy that whenever we get media requests or they get media requests, they contact me and they work through me. So that's always, when you work with peers, it's always a good thing to do. Another thing that occurred with this second suicide, and I don't know if it was because it was substance abuse involved or because of the friend network that this student had, a lot of people were being critical of the deceased student in the Facebook post, saying, oh, he was so stupid, he was an idiot, why did he do this? So the posts there were very negative, and we needed to work with the EOP program and the student's family, which was fortunately very easy to do, and so we were able to address that issue as well. For the third suicide, we certainly assessed the situation, but felt that because it was after graduation and people here were healing from the first two suicides, and because of the contextual circumstances, there are some things that we didn't do. We followed up with the family, of course, and did that. But the student wasn't connected to many other students, so we didn't do some of the things in our postvention protocol. The other thing that I want to mention in closing is that in every case of the three suicides, our president of our university sent out a message of condolence and was very clear about the fact, and of course with the permission of the families, that these were students who had died by suicide. So he mentioned his condolences and the loss to the campus community, and also mentioned in the email the sources of support that were available on campus. And as a result of that, then the last bullet, of course, you might imagine, we saw a huge increase in requests for service at the counseling center, so we prepared ourselves in terms of triaging and the like. And we also saw increases in our CareNet program, which is our referral program for students who have attempted suicide or talked about suicide. So again, the guidelines were so helpful to us that we read about, but it's also very, very important to look at your contextual factors and to move along with those. So on this note, I will end, and I will pass it on to Vic again, who will introduce Dr. Eells. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dolores. And I think particularly in describing the narratives and these tragic circumstances, you've opened up a lot of areas for us to discuss further on when we've heard from the other presenters and have some time for the panel discussion section. But it's now my pleasure to introduce Greg Eells, who is the Director of the Counseling and Psychological Services at Cornell and Associate Director of the Health Services at Cornell, who really has a particular experience in managing clusters around very public suicides, which I think present unique challenges for a campus, and he'll be sharing his experience in that regard with us. So turn it over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Vic. I appreciate that. And I'm having a little trouble with the web browser, so Vic's going to be advancing my slides for me on that, so you'll hear me ask him to do that. Vic, if you want to go to the first slide, it shows a little picture of just how beautiful Cornell's campus is. It is bracketed by 7 bridges. Those kind of bisect campus from central campus and the places where students live to where they study. And so students are kind of crossing these bridges. It's a beautiful campus in upstate New York. You can go to that second picture as well. But one of the things that we found here in Ithaca and at Cornell is there's been this kind of long history of these being what have been kind of iconic spots for suicides, not just among Cornell students, but also among residents of Ithaca and people in upstate New York. We've had people come to Ithaca to complete suicides from other states and other cities and municipalities. So it's a really kind of unique physical environment around this, overlaid with some of the issues around higher education. But I think one of the things to acknowledge around just talking this, and Vic, if you want to advance to the next slide, is just to acknowledge the complexities. I think Maddie did such a great job of going through some of the complexities of suicide clusters and the many, many factors that influence when someone completes a suicide. And when I talk about this, I often use this quote because I think it's a nice way of just conveying the complexity that's involved in trying to understand these phenomena and coming up with an appropriate response that's measured and doing all the things that we've already talked about. And this quote says, "What a job is this to measure lightning with a foot rule, the heart's turbulence with a pair of calipers." And I think that's what we're doing. And when we talk about suicide clusters, we're not just talking about individual hearts turbulence, but we're talking about many different hearts' turbulences and how that interacts with each other. And I think that complexity just sets a nice frame of humility around how we understand this. So our experience with the suicide cluster occurred in the 2009-2010 academic year. Vic, if you want to advance to that next slide. Well, we had 6 completed suicides in one academic year. And it was kind of interesting because the first 3 were not public in that sense. They were a combination of hanging deaths, some asphyxiation, and then a death that occurred, another hanging death that occurred off campus over the break. But they were still kind of creating this collective grief burden for our campus. And then the next 3 deaths occurred within 1 month, 2 within 2 days, or within back-to-back days of each other in the spring semester. And that's where it got quite a bit of media attention, that our campus became swarmed with CNN and pick your media outlet, as well as local media outlets. You know, Cornell is a relatively high-profile institution, and these natural areas kind of created this story that the media wanted to tell. And we were in this position of saying, well, you know, take this measured approach, trying to kind of convey this sense of here's responsible journalism. And one of the kind of key messages of this, we were talking about this over the break, that we really tried to get to the media was that this is different than any other story you will report. You are not reporting the facts. This is not like Watergate where you've got to dig and uncover something that people are trying to hide. You are part of the story. You're part of a public health message that creates or can lessen the risk for the population when you report on this. So we really had to try to work with the media in a very intense way to kind of take that approach. And we were actually much more successful with local media in our student newspaper because we had built some of those relationships. It was a little harder message with outside media outlets coming in wanting to tell their own story with large audiences and wanting to tell a story people wanted to hear rather than one that's a little more nuanced and is thinking about some of those public health approaches. But another thing that we really found important, and we have done this for years, is really keeping good suicide statistics, good data on, because for us the challenge was, this kind of myth that's been out there for quite a while that Cornell is a suicide school, which is not the case. I mean, we have been very diligent since 1990, keeping very good suicide statistics that indicate we've had 36 likely or confirmed suicides of enrolled Cornell students. And we really count enrollment. Many of those didn't happen on campus, some did, but that's kind of how we collected that data. And really we're pretty public saying, here's where it is, this is not the case. I'm really very kind of strong advocate for saying, there's no suicide school. There's so many factors that contribute to this. The school that you attend is not likely to be a factor that's going to contribute to a significant amount of the variances. I mean, there's no research that indicates that. There are a lot of other factors, as we've already talked about, that create suicide risk. Our average is about 1.4 for the last 25 years. With 22,000 students, that's lower than the rate you would expect of about 1.6, lower than the national average for 20,000 people in the U.S. So I think it's important to put in context half of the rate for people in the same age, not in college. I really think part of the messaging is to move away from that there's a specific suicide school or that some aspect of a higher education environment is contributing to that. I think one of the things that's important as we've looked at this data, for us, and I think this reflects nationally and brings up some questions, for us, 90% of our completed suicides were men. So that's a huge risk factor. 9-time increase compared to the 4 or 6-time increase, nationally for greater risk. Also for us, graduate students were overrepresented in those completed suicides, and that goes back even to some of the earlier data we had before 1990. I think that's a whole other area that nationally we need to think about. What are the risks to graduate students? What are the stressors? How can graduate students get isolated? And then the final piece was that there is something very unique about this environment. That jumping is this accessible means that does have a certain kind of component to the social milieu here. So 40% of our completed suicides were from jumping in and around the gorges and bridges in Cornell. So that's pretty unique. I mean, most of the data nationally is like 1 to 2% of suicides are jumping deaths. So those are some of the things that we really looked at and tried to be very upfront in kind of talking about. But, when you look at some of the data on jumping, we had Annette Boutre along with Maddie and Eric Kane come to our campus and talk about some of this, and Annette's done some great research on just what are the unique characteristics of suicide by jumping. I think looking at, younger, there's more of this short-term crisis, more psychological disorders, more impulsive. And also that if you do kind of do some things, and one of the things that we did, we're really focusing on means restriction, that there's this kind of impulsive component, there's ambivalence. Means restriction really creates a space that if you thwart the attempt, the person will usually survive. And at Cornell, we've been doing a lot of work prior to these suicides, and this is our kind of mental health framework that we had in place, really looking at the larger educational environment. How do we look at life skills, resilience? How do we increase help seeking? How do we identify people who need to be connected to care? How do we connect them to care well through triage and other kind of outreach? Let's talk, some of the other things that we do, that once you do that, you do lower the risk. How do we deliver coordinated crisis management, which we've talked about, and we do very similar things that Dolores does and many other people do. But then for us, the piece that was missing, or that was harder from a political standpoint to kind of make happen, was restricting access to means around jumping deaths. And when Maddie and Annette and Eric came, that was one of their main recommendations, is you've done a lot of great work around many of the aspects of this wheel, but for political or social reasons, the restricting access to means was one of the things that has been kind of limited. But, around this, I think it is important to just acknowledge some of the things that we talk about. The jumping deaths and these high-profile nature of the jumping deaths really does get a lot of attention, and we really do need to talk about some of the kind of contagion and social kind of contagion aspects of suicide. And I think it's often harder with jumping deaths. Even you look at the media response around the student at Penn and jumping from the top of a parking garage, that's garnered a lot more attention. I think we really have to continue to be very thoughtful about how we kind of convey those messages, how we make sure those messages fit within many of the things that we've already talked about. But for us, a lot of our efforts after this suicide cluster occurred, and the nature of the kind of 3 public jumping deaths, was to focus on means restriction. And also, I think a component of this, when you're doing things around means restriction, and UT Austin is another great case example of means restriction, where they've done some really nice work around putting kind of awnings over places where people jump off parking garages. It's been very successful because I think one of the things you have to fight around means restriction is this kind of public belief that suicide is somehow inevitable and that means restriction is ineffective, which is the exact opposite of what Annette Boutré's work says. Many people believe this, but actually what you find is when you do even put in place some fairly minimal and not intrusive barriers, you can change the culture. You can shape people's behavior. You can help kind of find a way in to change that impulsiveness. And once that impulse is gone, you really can have an impact and save some people's lives. So Vic, I'm sorry if you want to continue advancing your slides. I don't know if you're kind of continuing with me. But this is the slide on support for installing barriers, that bridge barriers really are effective. And that you do not see a substitution effect, which really is some of that research that goes against some of the public perception that somehow if you focus on means restriction, people will go somewhere else. That's not been found to be the case from some of the research on this slide on support for installing barriers. That once you do that, you can have a lasting impact. And I think it's really interesting, moving on to the slide on Joiner's model, that when you think about the different kind of ways of thinking about suicide. So you can put a lot of the risk factors into these broad categories that Thomas Joiner does in some of his work, looking at kind of thwarted belongingness in a social setting, feeling like you're a burden on people around you, feeling they'd be better off without you, all the factors that contribute to that around mental illness, substance use. And then this kind of practice piece, that finding ways to work up to it. And this is where means restriction, I think, can be very effective. So for us, in our experience, moving on to the next slide, around bridges where students are walking from where they live to campus, every trip to class within Joiner's model could be seen as a process of habituating for a student who's contemplating suicide. With graduate students, they are older, they have more time to habituate. That can also be the case. From being in graduate school, that kind of thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness, all that can be there. But really taking out of the equation the habituation that can occur through crossing bridges. And I think that was kind of a really important piece for us as we looked at means restriction. So moving on to the means restriction piece, in our case, Annette's at Cornell, it really does, I think, disrupt the ability to enact lethal self-injury and can remove the bridges from a habituation process. We've also had students in counseling talk to us about how the nets disrupt this feeling of being alone, so kind of that sense of not belonging. Students have said that the nets and fences do provide a sense of being cared for. We've had students say that. Some of them have said, well, you could get around it anyway. We've had these really interesting mixed responses clinically. But they are a kind of tangible daily reminder of the extent the university is committed to preventing suicide. So Vic, if you want to move on to the next slide, which shows some of the successful installation of the nets on some of our bridges on campus, which really, I think, create a nice visual, create a sense of safety and public health. Moving on to kind of the next slide, you can show this is what it looks like looking down off a bridge into one of the gorges near campus. And this has been a very, very effective intervention in many, many ways. But going through this cluster of 6 suicides, I think we really acknowledged several principles that I think are important to kind of think about. You know, one, when there are multiple deaths on campus or multiple suicides, you have to openly and very transparently acknowledge the pain and the grief burden on your community. It's very important not to be insular or defensive, to be as transparent as possible. Like I said earlier in the first session, you're always balancing that with how you're interacting with the family, how much information you have. It's not always, you know, it's not the university's responsibility socially to determine whether it's a suicide or not. So they're always, you know, you have that responsibility to be accurate, and you're always fighting that with social media, which has no responsibility to be accurate, but is very quick. But what's really important as an institution is to not be insular or defensive. When there is a cluster, when there are multiple suicides, it's important to just recognize that, realize it's a public health emergency, make sure you're proactive in communications. Ideally, you've formed those relationships with the local press and have figured out ways to be proactive when you're communicating. And then acknowledging means restriction. Though Cornell has this unique physical environment, there are many campuses that may have some risk around tall buildings. You know, NYU with the Lopes Tower went through some of this, and really thinking about where will means restriction be effective, whether that's looking at locking up access to chemicals, whether that's locking up rooftops, or doing things to kind of change the physical structure on your campus. We had Henry Chung, who many of you know from NYU, who's an alum of Cornell, visit one of our buildings that had a very open stairwell. And he suggested to a dean that, well, maybe this could create some risk. And they used a student art project to kind of fill in the space and reduce means. So it doesn't have to be something so visible as kind of nets on bridges. There are many very creative ways that you can engage in to kind of look at that physical environment. That being said, I think it's also important to acknowledge that even when you do everything right, you can still get sued. So we did have a lawsuit after this by the family of one of the students who died in that cluster, actually the first person. And the argument was, well, because you put the nets up, you should have done it sooner, and that you're legally liable for not doing it sooner, preventing my son's death, that it was potentially foreseeable. In this case, there was no kind of legal ruling. The claims against the individuals, and myself included, some other administrators here, were dropped. The case was settled, but Cornell created a scholarship, and the city of Ithaca's insurance carrier settled for $100,000. So I think it's an interesting just kind of lesson, and for me it was really interesting to still do the right thing, even though sometimes there may be legal repercussions for that. And to wrap up, I would just say, you know, we're all going to face completed suicides. Some of us will even face clusters, and you know, I think we have to accept that reality. But I think we also have to work every day to reduce the risk and reduce that number of completed suicides for all of our student population. I think something like this webinar really helps us understand the data, the theories around suicide clusters that are really essential for effective clinical public health responses. It's really the responsibility of all of us to reduce these preventable deaths. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Vic and to Phil.
Thanks, Greg. You covered a lot of ground, as you often do, very quickly. Thanks for your efficiency. I'd like to introduce Phil Meilman, who I suppose appropriately for this section of our presentation is going to be focusing on the steps that he's come to understand as being most helpful in doing postventions after a suicide on campus. And he'll share some thoughts about obviously dealing with clusters as well, but I'd like to turn it over now to Phil Meilman.
Thank you, Victor. I appreciate the introduction, and it's good to be here today. What this part of the webinar is going to be about is more of a how-to and less theoretical. What I want to do, as you can see on the slide there, is talk about postvention. And the way I look at it, of course, postvention is intervention after an adverse event occurs. But the way I look at it, as I mentioned earlier, is that postvention is really prevention because, again, as I noted earlier, when there is a suicide, anyone who has had a suicidal thought tends to revisit it at that time. So it's a time of higher risk. And as we all know, with a suicide, every suicide leaves in its wake a devastated group of survivors on the college campus and elsewhere in the form of friends, teammates, sorority sisters, fraternity brothers, romantic partners, roommates, coaches, faculty members. And so it's something that is so deeply personal and so deeply affecting. What we tried to do, and this dates back to my time at Cornell, and I was at Cornell from 1996 to 2005, so this dates back to my time. We created a program, a formalized program to do postventions, but to do them in a way that made sense and was organic and intuitive, because we felt that that would reach the audience we wanted to reach the best. And of course, some of this came out of some of the gorge deaths that Greg just spoke about. There was one photograph that he showed looking down, and I don't think you can get a clear sense from that bridge of how, in that photograph, how deep that drop is, but it's got to be what, maybe 150, 175 feet, something on that order.
I think you're right.
And when you and what you're falling down into, if there's a jumping death in that location, is you're landing onto pure granite. There's maybe a foot or two of water, but it's rock. It's solid rock. And so we experienced some of those gorge deaths, and we decided that we had to do something to help the community. And prior to 1998, there really wasn't an organized plan for doing it. So we decided, after a number of meetings with students who were affected by other students' suicide, that we needed to have something a little bit more structured. So what we came up with was a program that we called community support meetings. Now, it is a postvention, but the word postvention is an awfully clinical sounding term, and it's not one that's used by the lay public. So we called these things instead community support meetings, and the way they would be billed to the campus community is that we are having a community support meeting for friends of John Doe, the deceased, or friends of, we're having a community support meeting for friends of Mary Smith. And everyone can relate to community support. It's a very non-threatening term. Its emphasis is on two terms. One is community and the other is support. And that's something that everyone can rally behind. Now, in order to do this, what we did was we recruited a cadre of people all across the campus, and it really didn't matter whether they were from the counseling center or the dean's office or faculty or campus ministry. It really didn't make any difference what department they were from. These were people, these were faculty and staff who had an interest in helping students navigate through the crisis of a suicide. And what we would do would be to have monthly meetings. Every month we would all sit together and review protocols, and if there were a community support meeting, we would then do a review of that, how that went, what worked well, what didn't work well. So this is part of the infrastructure that we had in place. And that's important because when an adverse event happens, you've got to be at the ready. You've got to be able to, on a fairly short notice, be able to gather the troops of who's going to do this and when and where they're going to meet. So in this first slide, as you'll see here, what is a community support meeting? It's a reproducible means of bringing a college community together in the aftermath. And when you're going to do something like this, you've got to do some preparation. So the first point is you really need to sit down and brainstorm who's affected here. And you have to think about roommates, hallmates, teammates, fraternity sorority members, activity groups. So you've got to think of all the populations that are affected. And with any one student, they're probably a member of multiple groups. So you've got to get announcements out to all of those groups. The second thing is you've got to decide who's going to facilitate the meeting. Now, normally what we would do in a case like that is someone from the counseling center and a campus minister would be the facilitators. Now, we would have other individuals there. We would have deans. We would have faculty. We would have the campus police present. But generally, two people needed to facilitate. Two people is really helpful, and it's helpful to have counseling and ministry because for a couple of reasons. One is there's a spiritual component, of course, to reflection, and there's a psychological component, of course, to the trauma. But the other reason for having two people there is when one is speaking, the other can observe and can jump in if needed, where it's needed. So it's very good to have that present as facilitators. The next thing is I certainly would recommend having tables on the side full of refreshments, cookies, cake, soft drinks, what have you. It sets a welcoming tone. Oftentimes I have found that students don't avail themselves of it. It doesn't matter. It's the tone you're setting, and you want to set a tone that they can get up and help themselves to some refreshment if they want it. The next piece here is in terms of timing. You know, people can only grieve for so long at a time. An hour is about as much as people can handle. So what we do is we announce that the meeting will be 1 hour in length, and we try to stick with that. Now, typically what's happened is it's gone maybe an hour and 10, hour and 15, but we don't really want to go much more than that because otherwise people get overwhelmed. And what we want to do is help them, not overwhelm them. Okay, so this is the how-to part. So, and I've listed it in terms of steps. So step one, you introduce all the staff who are present. You explain about confidentiality. You explain about the meeting duration so they understand when the meeting will end. In the beginning, when we first did this, we would have student media present. We learned very quickly to request that any reporters identify themselves and exit unless they're willing to put down their pens and be part of the conversation as a participant but not as a reporter. Sometimes what we've done in cases like that is say we'll take, if they are not a participant and they do want to be a reporter, we'll let them exit, but we'll take down their phone number and their email address and indicate to participants if they want to talk to a reporter, here's the contact information. Most people don't take us up on that. The next step is explain how the death occurred so that everyone is working from the same set of facts. Now, this is a little bit different than what we've been talking about with media reporting, where people don't know the student, it's at a distance, this is a much more personal setting. People knew the deceased. They had very close relationships with that person. The rumor mill is probably flying at that point about exactly what happened. And it is a rumor mill because a lot of the information is not accurate. Greg mentioned the term transparency. I think that's a very important term to use, a very important concept with this. Oftentimes we have had campus police or a campus minister, but oftentimes campus police or a dean just identify what are the known facts about this so that everybody is operating from the same set of facts. If you don't have that, it gets very disruptive because one set of individuals has one set of ideas, somebody else has another set of ideas, and you get into a debate about it. It's much better just to indicate what you know and what you don't know, so that everybody's working from the same set of information. So now we get to the third step, and just an acknowledgement of what a difficult time this is. And at that point, to compliment the students for actually showing up. I mean, this is a very brave act. Sometimes people are filled with fear and trepidation. What's going to happen? I'm afraid to be there. So you want to reinforce their being there and praise them. By the way, I should note at this point that in terms of the numbers of people who are present, we've done these kinds of community support meetings for groups as small as 5 and as large as 85, and could go larger. And they, regardless of the size, it seems to work very well. So size does not seem to make a difference here. Now, the fourth step here that you'll see on the screen is the single most important step. And this is really, in effect, this is grief work. So typically, the facilitators did not know the student who died. So we take a stance, which is, you know, we did not know John Doe or Mary Smith, whoever it was, and we're very sad about what we heard happen, but we didn't know them. Maybe you could share with us and educate us about John Doe or Mary Smith, and tell us about them. What were they like? What was your experience like? And sometimes there's an initial silence, which usually does not last very long, and sometimes there is no silence. And what you find is that students begin to tell stories. They tell stories about the last time they saw the person. They tell stories about something sad that happened. They tell stories about something that was hysterically funny that the student did. They talk about how they were on the volleyball team. They start telling stories, and it's kind of like ping pong. They ping against each other, and as one starts to tell a story, it reminds someone else of another story, and then that person tells a story. And they just keep telling stories, and what you see is tears and laughter and sadness and gratitude for having known the person. In other words, this is the grief work taking place. So typically, we will let this go on for as long as it needs to go on for. And usually, it's not hugely long. It might be 10, 15, 20 minutes. But we just let them tell stories. And in the telling of stories, they are beginning, even those who aren't telling stories are hearing their experience told that they had with the deceased. Now, at this point, I usually do a little psychoeducation, not a lot, because I don't want it to turn into a classroom lecture. but just talk briefly about the grieving process in very simple terms. But the most important message is that there is no right and no wrong way to grieve. Every reaction to death is normal, and there's no right way and no wrong way to go through it. So that's a very brief step. Step number 6, this is what I call the what ifs and the if onlys. Now, we all know that suicide is multiply determined in terms of etiology. It's so complex that if any one piece of the puzzle had changed, it would be unlikely to change the overall picture. I mean, it's possible, but unlikely, because usually by the time the person gets to this point, they are so desperate that in the aftermath, no one thing that a person did might make a difference. So we talk about the what ifs, and most people in that room are thinking to themselves, if only I had done X, this person would still be alive. So they make it personal about them. If only I had done this, or what if I had done that? And what we typically say is, we just describe the what ifs and the if onlys, and we say, you know, people in this room may be having some what ifs and if onlys. Would some of you be willing to say what those are? And if you're not willing to talk about your own, could you speculate what might be some of the what ifs or if onlys in this room? And they do that, and they begin to talk about it, and that also begins to ping around the room about something they said or something they didn't do, or I should have called back last night, or I should have gone over and visit. And what we're really getting at is the question of guilt. And when they realize that they are not alone with that, and that people have different if-onlys, and that there's a multiple of what-ifs, they begin to feel a little bit more comfortable, and it lessens the degree of guilt. And, of course, guilt can interfere with the grieving process. And this tends to be very relieving to the people in the room. And that's where we say, after the fact, that if you had only changed one little what-if, it probably wouldn't have changed the outcome. So, you know, it's important to understand that everybody has a what-if, and you're not alone with that. So we talk about that. Then the next step is this document that I found called Suggestions for Survivors by a writer named Iris Bolton. Usually at this point, what I do is I actually read from this list. And the reason I read from it is that these are 25 suggestions that have come from survivors of other people's suicide that they have found help them. So I usually present this list, and I read it very slowly. I say to people, if some of these things make sense to you, take them. If they don't make sense to you, let them go. But take the ones that are important to you. And what I'd like to do, if you'll indulge me here for a couple of minutes, I'd like to just read them to you. I'm going to read them faster than I would normally read them. I would normally read each one slowly and then pause after each one and let people just absorb them. But let me just run through this list. Know you can survive. You may not think so, but you can. Struggle with why it happened until you no longer need to know why, or until you're satisfied with partial answers. Know you may feel overwhelmed by the intensity of your feelings, but all your feelings are normal. Anger, guilt, confusion, forgetfulness are common responses. You're not crazy, you're in mourning. Be aware that you may feel appropriate anger at the person, at the world, at God, at yourself. You may feel guilty for what you think you did or did not do. Having suicidal thoughts is common. It does not mean that you will act on those thoughts. Remember to take one moment or one day at a time. Find a good listener with whom to share. Call someone if you need to talk. Don't be afraid to cry. Tears are healing. Give yourself time to heal. Remember, the choice was not yours. No one is the sole influence in another's life. Expect setbacks. Don't panic if emotions return like a tidal wave. You may only be experiencing a remnant of grief and unfinished peace. Try to put off major decisions. Give yourself permission to get professional help. Be aware of the pain of your family and friends. Be patient with yourself and with others who may not understand. Set your own limits and learn to say no. Steer clear of people who want to tell you what or how to feel. Know that there are support groups which can be helpful, such as the Compassionate Friends. Call on your personal faith to help you through. It is common to experience physical reactions to your grief. For example, headaches, loss of appetite, inability to sleep. The willingness to laugh with others and at yourself is healing. Wear out your questions, anger, guilt, or other feelings until you can let them go. Know that you will never be the same again, but you can survive and go beyond just surviving. So as I say, I read that list slowly, pausing between each item, letting them absorb that, and then I usually pause at the end. And it's interesting because there's almost a spiritual feel in the room when you get done with that. I mean, it's a time of real reflection. Now, we've done these community support meetings not just in the aftermath of suicides, although that's how it started, but we've also done it in the aftermath of other tragic events, death by natural causes, for example. 23 out of those 25 items are still appropriate if you use this format for a non-suicide tragedy. The next step is to talk about the importance of community and looking after one another. If someone is isolating or looks distraught, seek them out, talk to them, encourage them, get together with them. So we reinforce this notion of community and reaching out to one another. The next step is we identify the resources on and off campus, deans, clergy, counseling, res life staff, peer counseling, telephone hotlines, faculty members, advisors, coaches, friends, and parents. So we advise them about all of the possible resources that are available to them. At Cornell, we would typically have a memorial service that would occur, and it was usually student-organized and student-run, but facilitated by campus ministry. So we would typically make an announcement for those who were interested in doing some planning for that, to stay for a few minutes afterwards to organize, to plan a time to meet, to talk about what that memorial service would look like. As I said, those memorial services are typically student-run, at least they are at Cornell, and oftentimes the parents of the deceased are invited to attend, and they put together a memorial book with photographs and memories, and they often will present that to the parents. It's a very healing kind of experience. And then finally, the final step is an announcement that the staff who are present will stay for a few minutes afterward in case anyone wants to talk individually, and they will take you up on that. I do recommend on the refreshment table having business cards and brochures available for all the possible resources. Now, how has this worked? It's actually worked amazingly well. I published this in the Journal of American College Health with my colleague, Dean Tanny Hall at Cornell. It has been used by any number of other schools, and the nice part and what we were hoping for is that they tried this format and it worked. So the idea here was to promulgate this and let people take it into their own setting and use it. It's as far as I can tell, it's a perfectly reproducible format that can be used most anywhere. What happens in the aftermath of this? Let me give you an example. We had one group, we had a men's and women's sport team at Cornell, I remember way back when. Nobody was talking prior to the postvention. The coaches didn't know what to say to the students didn't know what to say to each other, they didn't know what to say to the coaches. Everyone was bottled up. We did this postvention. There were some 85 people in the room. When we got to the very end of it, people didn't leave the room. They stood around milling about, talking, hugging, crying. It was an amazing thing to witness. What we had done was we had broken the ice, and everybody was talking to each other, and that's precisely what we wanted to happen. They had begun the grieving process. They had begun to come together as a community. So that experience really struck me, and that is not an uncommon experience with these kinds of postventions. So on that note, I will stop. As I said, we did publish this in the Journal of American College Health. It was published in 2006, and you'll find it in that journal. So
I just want to add, Phil, that I mean, I've been here for the decade since you've left, and we've continued to use this model. It's been very effective, and it's everything you've talked about is continuing to happen under that same structure.
That's great. Victor, back to you.
Right. Thanks, Phil, Greg, and Dolores for these powerful and really moving comments about how some of the principles we heard about from Maddie and Kerri actually come into play, unfortunately, in the face of campus tragedies, but how much of a difference it can make when a campus and the staff are thoughtful and sensitive about implementing these things and putting these principles into action. I think the one comment I'd like to make before we ask Kerri and Maddie to comment on what we've heard in this section is that I think it's important to understand that you need both the principles that we heard about at the first part of this conversation, but it's obvious, too, in hearing about the lived experiences on campuses, how unpredictable and variable these responses need to be. The planning needs to take into account the fact that the context of timing and place of death and where the person was positioned in relation to others on campus can make a tremendous difference in terms of what the impact is on other students and on the rest of the campus and in how the campus responds. So it's really something that you see that you need to be very strongly grounded in the principles, but at the same time, you need to be prepared to improvise and adjust to circumstances because every situation has its own unique trajectory and circumstances that need to be thought through and need to be reacted to and responded to. With that, I'm going to ask Kerri and Maddie to just make a few comments in response to what we've heard. And then we'll have some time to discuss some questions that have been submitted by the audience. Again, just to remind you, you have the Q&A bar at the top of your screen. You can type your question and then hit enter or ask, and we'll get to as many as we can.
Great. Thanks, Vic. This is Kerri. I think everyone who presented provided some really great thoughts. And in reflecting on what everyone said, I think some folks may feel concerned that there's no way you're going to be able to prepare for everything that could happen, and it is really dependent on the situation. But I hope what came out of this conversation is that it's really vital to do some planning up front. So getting a team together, really thinking through some of the steps you would take, some of your communications, whether you would host a memorial or what considerations you would have around those so that you're prepared to respond if something does occur. So I hope that was conveyed. And also, I think we see a lot of campuses that struggle around the means restriction piece that Greg spoke about. So I think the other piece to reiterate is there's some really simple steps, and Greg mentioned the stairwell example, that there are simple steps like restricting access to chemicals and in chemistry labs, making sure windows aren't easily open to a full length, locking doors to rooftops, things like that that don't require a massive overhaul like creating nets and bridge barriers, as Greg mentioned. So there are ways we can do little steps that also make a huge difference. And then also I just wanted to comment quickly about this concept of memorials. It can be a really difficult decision, and I want to say that there's no right or wrong answer, but I think when you're dealing with suicide clusters, you run the risk of losing that therapeutic feel of having a memorial for a student, and then it becomes kind of this continued grief process that can be a little bit more difficult to handle. So there's certainly some considerations about memorials that we could talk a lot about, but I think one of the main things is you don't want to host a memorial for a student who's died by suicide if you don't host memorials for those who die by other means, and just work with family and friends to figure out if this is the right way to honor the student or if there's some other way that they could, and knowing that, you know, overly romanticizing or doing anything that makes it look like you're glorifying suicide could pose some risks. So you kind of have to weigh all of those options, and as I said, there's really no one right or wrong answer. It's really dependent on what's going on your campus, but certainly to consider. So I think everyone did a wonderful job, and thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences.
Maddie?
Yeah, thanks. I think what has become, you know, very clear to all of us is how Phil and Greg and Dolores all really showed immense respect for the community as they developed their, you know, post-vention plans. And that's what I, you know, want to just say a couple of comments about that. And I think that Kerri was, you know, alluding to it as well. The need to balance the needs of mourners while still minimizing, you know, the likelihood of contagion. And so, you know, most students and, you know, perhaps other community members as well really have a desire to do something. You know, they want to do something. And if you don't do, you know, in other venues, you know, people talk about collaborative problem solving, then I think it's the collaboration that's, you know, always key, but that, you know, we do want to shape what gets done. And so things that, you know, as you develop your plan and you have, whether it's a, you know, community support meetings to get, you know, these various, they call them, you know, I guess I could call them, you know, people who are grieving as well. I was going to say stakeholders, and that sounded awfully cold, so I wanted to change that. But other things is that if it is the newspaper, you know, the student newspaper, you know, to encourage some of the things that might shape the desire, as well as educating them that they're part of that, you know, public health response, as Greg was mentioning, is to encourage stories of resilience and help-seeking and coping, you know, so that we have more of a, you know, been coined that topic, Chino effect. Or if they're not sure about, you know, what activities to engage in, you know, you can encourage them volunteering. Dolores mentioned that she has a hotline at the university, or which I thought was a peer-run hotline, but I wasn't sure. That they could, you know, given their age, they could volunteer at their nearest, you know, Lifeline crisis center, or participate in, you know, other suicide prevention efforts that have now been well established, such as the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Out of Darkness walks. And I'm sure that SHED Foundation has a slew of other things for college students to participate in. So I think that, we're all encouraging the same thing, to minimize contagion as we shape the activities after someone's suicide, and that if, Kerri said this, and I, have been saying it for years as well, that if something is done in the aftermath of someone who died by means other than suicide, then we have to make sure that we have that, similar or fair response after a suicide, and I'm thinking specifically, of a memorial, but that there are, lots of things that we can do to help shape, students, quote, desire to do something. We just want them to do something that's safe as well as useful.
Thanks, Maddie. So we have a number of questions that are coming in, and actually there have been a number of questions that are around specific details around the model that Phil presented, around how long after the death occurs and how long is the program. Some of the things Phil alluded to, other things not, but I would suggest people use the resource. Go back to the reference that Phil mentioned. It'll be again on the website, and also you can read more about some suggestions around postvention in general at the Higher Education Mental Health Alliance. HEMA has recently released a postvention guide for college campuses, which includes many of the references we've spoken about in relation to postvention. One question from the audience that I'd like to present to all of the panelists is, we've talked a lot about the campus-wide activities and a lot of the things that can be done across the system, but are there particular steps that all of you might recommend around identifying students at risk for contagion or students who may be at risk after a suicide? What are the things that the system can do, whether the counseling system, the student affairs department, that might help to identify ahead of time students who may be getting into difficulty?
I'll start with that one. At our counseling center, that's one of the first things we do as part of our postvention process. So we work with key stakeholders who would have had contact with the deceased student and their friends, particularly on our residential campus, the Department of Residential Life staff, because they're very easily able to identify the student's close friends, roommates, suite mates, hall mates, and then we actually locate some of the postvention activities right in the hall. We have a laptop computer that's packed for postvention with business cards, handouts, and we actually position ourselves there. We have a communication system with our Dean of Undergraduate Studies and Academic Affairs Division, and communicate back and forth the names of those students, of course, with appropriate permissions for academic accommodations and the like. And we ask the students in the network, the friend network, if they can identify other students, fraternity and sorority members, fellow athletes, and the like. So it's really a fact-finding process and looking at the system of and network that the student had.
Great, thanks. Anybody else have it?
Yeah, I would just add, I think there's a whole, I've done multiple presentations kind of on our wheel that I think also looks at that. I would agree with what Phil said, that anything you're doing postvention is also outreach. You're labeling, you're kind of creating a space where, here's what's going on with you, it's okay, accept that, here's where you can get resources. For us, our Let's Talk program is a way where our counselors are always out in the community, so I think those are kind of really important aspects of this too, that your counseling service is not just seen as kind of in the walls of the counseling center, that you're out there in a lot of different ways, and that when these tragedies happen, students turn to you if they need you. I think a lot of it is doing what Phil said, normalizing, and then being available if you recognize kind of these things going on, these signs and symptoms, that you may need to talk to somebody from the counseling service.
Another resource is that most universities have at this point would be the Student of Concern Committee, because when a student is isolating or upset or people are worried, usually it's coming to the attention of a lot of people who are sitting around that table. And at the Students of Concern Committee meeting, people can be dispatched, whether it's residence life or campus ministry or or the dean's office or other offices. They can be dispatched to reach out to look in on those students about whom there's special concern.
So I think that's a very important point, because we sometimes lose sight of the fact that, while close friends or people who might share, strong social connections to the person who died are, clearly people who we need to be concerned about. On any campus, there are a group of other people who have their own vulnerabilities and might have their own reasons for either identifying with the person who died or simply maybe struggling already with suicidal ideation. If we go back to the beginning, we all know that, a significant percentage of students on any campus are at any moment having potential thoughts of suicide. And those people, as Maddie also talked about, the approach avoidance, may be in some balance whose equilibrium has shifted slightly as a result of a death on campus. So we need to be really alert and vigilant in relation to those students who are at risk, not because of their proximity, but because of a psychological connection to the person who died.
Related to that, may I just make another suggestion?
Sure, please, yeah.
Is online screening, an anonymous online screening. Preferably this would be done by all, colleges and universities before, and hopefully suicide would never occur. But preferably before, maybe as incoming freshmen, but it could be done, I think, in a post-vention context as well. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has been first piloting and now helping schools to implement online screening as a means of getting students who are not already linked to services engaged with, mental health professionals at the colleges.
So you're referring to the interactive screening program?
Yes.
Yeah, which we use. A lot of universities use that.
Exactly. And
so it's an excellent program. We're actually just expanding it to all incoming graduate students, going back to what I was talking about. And I think that's for us, that's such an untapped area of, I think, research and understanding is what our graduate students experience being in this unique position of kind of employees, but still students. The unique stressors they have.
So you raised actually graduate students before. There are two populations who we haven't really spoken much about who maybe present particular challenges, and one is graduate students and the other is international students. Would any of you like to talk a little bit about what are some of the steps that we can take directed towards these groups of students that, again, in the face of a suicide and dealing with a post-vention, a concern about contagion, these are some of the students who are difficult to reach and connect with. Yeah. What are some thoughts about?
I think for us, I would reiterate again the interactive screening program. We have sent that to international students and to incoming and graduate students because, for those reasons. I think they are often hard to reach. For us, having a Let's Talk site in the International Students and Scholars Office was really, really important because, international students are there. And, since 9/11, those offices' focus is primarily on visa issues, student visas. So it's harder for them to do some of the support work they used to do. So having a staff member there who's kind of seen as part of the community and, has a certain level of cultural competence has been very powerful.
And we do the same thing at Albany. And in addition, we have each psychologist in our counseling center is a liaison to a contact office that works with our different high-risk populations. So we have a liaison to our international students office, our graduate student office, our EOP program, athletics. We have a link to the veteran services as well, so that our colleagues have an ongoing relationship with somebody in our center.
And this is Kerri. I feel like both Greg and Dolores make the point that all of this should be happening well before a crisis. So hopefully you're figuring out who is at most risk on your campus, what are the gaps and needs there, and starting your prevention work and creating partnerships and allies with those students and with the organizations on campus that they are a part of or departments that serve them, so that you can really learn what those particular needs are well before anything occurs.
Is there a role for students in postvention activities?
Yes, I actually oversee a program called Middle Earth Peer Assistance Program, which has been around a long time at our university. They operate under my supervision, a hotline service, a peer ed program, and there are also some students in peer career advising. And they are very active in postvention. We have them join us. We train them, of course, so very often they can deliver difficult and engage in difficult dialogues, and students approach them much more quickly than they might for us, for example. And the students actually initiate on their own some very nice things like cooking meals for students and bringing things to them, just very nice gestures that support the message of condolence. So there are a lot of things that students can do, and I find that they are very eager to step up as soon as possible after a tragedy.
And it can be very helpful, I think, psychologically to feel as if there are things you can do to make it better. So it's helpful both for the students who are in that peer supportive role, and it's helpful for the other students to see, students who are stepping up in that role and to participate in that in any way they can. We haven't at all addressed in this discussion, and maybe as we come around towards the end of this, I'm going to put forth a two-part question. And we haven't talked about the impact on both the student affairs and counseling center staff in the face of dealing with a suicide, and even more challengingly, a suicide cluster on a campus. And that's clearly something that presents a dramatic challenge. And part B to that is, when do you think about bringing in outside consultants?
Well, I'll just start with that. I mean, one of the things I would say is it's very, very important to be aware of the vicarious traumatization that goes along with this. I think, especially around public suicides where there are people, staff are maybe on site or being right there, you have to do things to attend to the folks who are doing the community support meetings that Phil talked about. I mean, I think it is a real issue in making time to have those conversations and realize your staff is not an endless well. It needs to be replenished. You need to look out for your staff. You need to be supportive. You really need to focus on staff wellness and resilience when you're dealing with stuff like this. So, for me, I think that is a huge component. I think when you're, in terms of the second part of your question, when you bring in consultants, for us, when we had three suicides in public ways in a very short period of time, it was clear to us we were part of a cluster and it was going to be high profile, and we needed to get outside kind of perspective. So for us, it was really important when we brought in Maddie and Annette and Eric. But we also had Henry Chung come in right away, too, to kind of set the stage for that. So we had some folks come in and really say, like, let's create a conversation in a way where you can not be defensive and really have an open conversation.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts about that?
In addition to what Greg said, which we have also done on our campus, I think it's also important to be aware of the cultural context. And what really helped us is to already have the liaison relationships with the different colleagues on campus, because our EOP program, for example, is very closed. They do not let anybody that they don't know well from the outside, from our counseling center or anywhere else, work with their students or work with them. And speaking of working with them, that program, again, being very closed and knowing its students very well, they needed some help in self-care. So we did groups with the staff, and then the staff was sharing, experiences about relatives that had completed suicides and that kind of thing. So also very important to look at the self-care of our staff colleagues who we work with.
Sure.
And Vic, this is Kerri. I'm happy. As the social worker in me is just delighted that you asked this question because I think it's really vitally important when you're dealing especially with a cluster. I'm sure our other presenters can attest it's really difficult on the people who are in crisis mode trying to just figure out how to stop this. So it's really important to take care of the people who are on the front lines and check in. And I think, one of the other important steps is to have some debriefing time with staff once things have calmed down a little and just make sure everyone is aware of what they should do for themselves. I know that's often easier said than done, but hopefully you can also watch out for each other as this is happening.
Right. That's definitely very important. And one final question for the group. Is there such thing as a campus doing too much in response to a suicide or a cluster of suicides?
I wouldn't say
challenging question, huh?
I mean, I would say, I think one of the challenges is to really be thoughtful about what you're doing. And sometimes more is not better. I mean, I think there's it's a delicate balance. You want to be there. You want to do many of the things that we've talked about. But I think it's also, there's a tendency in higher education and in any setting when there's something publicly wrong happens, it's like you've got to, well, we were prepared and we had the plan in place and we could have prevented it. I mean, I think the challenge is just kind of realizing no plan is going to prevent human suffering from occurring in the future. You can do things, you have to create these systems. All the things we talked about are incredibly valuable, and I think there has to be a certain humility that kind of says, don't do something just because you want to look like you're doing something. Do the kind of things that really matter.
And it's also important to examine the context, because in our cluster suicide experience, the third student who had died by suicide was somebody who wasn't connected in it, and the suicide occurred after graduation. So we recommended that a condolence message not go out to the campus community because the community was still healing from the first two suicides. And so, there are decisions that can be made by an examination of the context.
Right. That's great. Yeah. Well, we're just about at the top of the hour, and this has been a really rich and fascinating and hopefully helpful conversation to those of you who've been participating in this webinar. I think what we've really, if I can just kind of try to pull the different streams together, we've really tried to present for you a strong theoretical basis, a series of principles for thinking about how a campus can deal with suicides and more specifically with these very tragic suicide clusters that sometimes come up. But I think in hearing from the campus-based people in the second half of the program, we've come to hear again how the principles need to be then really adjusted with sensitivity and flexibility to the particular vicissitudes of the circumstances and situations that come up, taking into account all kinds of facts and information in dynamic and very, very challenging circumstances. So I think we've been fortunate today to hear from really the leading experts that are out there in, who've both experienced and thought about and worked in these areas. And we thank all of you for participating. We thank SAMHSA and, again, all of our speakers, and Richard McKeon and Jen Capella and their team for helping to facilitate this. And we hope this was productive again. This has been recorded and will be appearing, as you see, on the SAMHSA, JED Foundation, and SPRC websites. You can also, as we've mentioned, learn more about postvention in college settings at the HEMA website through the postvention guide that's there. And we hope none of you need to ever use what you've heard about today. Thank you for participating with us.